Oh, hi class. We're about to have a little tutorial today on genetics. So stay tuned, pay attention, and let's learn something together. So this is the question we're trying to answer today, and we're going to learn some vocabulary along the way as well. But we're trying to figure out what is genetics. So before we talk about what genetics is exactly, I think we need to talk about something called traits. So the first question we need to answer is, what are traits? And this is a vocabulary word you need to become familiar with. But traits are a characteristic. And it can be a physical characteristic, that is something we can see with our eyes. And so it might be something like eye color, for example, can be a characteristic, or the size of your nose, but something we can see. And it might be something that we can't see. And so I'll get to that in a moment. But the characteristic is always determined by our DNA, and specifically there's certain sections of DNA we learned were called genes. And so these genes code for these characteristics or traits. And specifically the genes code for proteins, and then the proteins create the trait. So we might have a protein in our eyes that makes our eyes pink. Nobody's eyes are pink, that's just a silly example. But the protein would be pink in color, and therefore our eyes would appear pink. Let's use this picture here to talk about a couple examples of traits. We can see two people here. One is myself and one is my wife. And we can see things, for example, like eye color. And we can see my wife has brown eyes and I have blue eyes. And so those are traits. We can also see, for example, another example of a trait could be hair color, brown hair, and under the hat we have some difficulty here because I'm balding, and so we have some balding genes that code for that. But you can see the hair color that you do see on myself is brown. So these are some examples of traits. We can talk about the shape of noses. We could talk about ear shape. These are all traits that are controlled by genetics, but there's also some traits we can't see inside us. And so we have certain things like maybe I am prone to heart disease. This is a trait, and we can't see that, but it is still controlled by the genes that I have. And so that's an example of a trait we can't see. Some other examples of traits we may not be able to see are certain people prone to addiction, certain people prone to obesity. Those are other things we can't see, but a lot of the traits we talk about in this chapter are going to be physical traits that we can see. So now let's answer our original question that we first asked. What is genetics? The reason we talked about traits first is because genetics is the study of how traits are inherited or how they are passed down from generation to generation. Why do you look like your dad or mom or maybe a grandparent? That is the type of thing we are observing here. Traits are passed down from generation to generation, and genetics studies this. So if we're going to be studying genetics, we have to be able to use some terminology. And one of the words that I'm going to introduce to you today is the word allele. And that's kind of a weird word. It's pretty technical in genetics, but we're going to use it in class, and you'll read it in your textbook and hear it on videos and things like that. And so I want you to be familiar with it. An allele is basically a gene, but when we talk about genes that are for traits, these genes often have different forms. And so we use the word allele. We use the word allele for different forms for a gene, okay? And remember that genes are a certain section of DNA. And these sections of DNA or these genes are going to code for different traits. So if we're talking about, for example, eye color again, So if we're talking about eye color, there is a gene on our DNA that codes for eye color, and maybe it's blue this time. And so what happens is genes work in pairs, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. So let's go to that. So we talked earlier about genes and what they are a little bit, and what DNA is and what chromosomes are. And let's go into a little bit of detail here for this. For human beings, chromosomes, there are 46 chromosomes in each cell. And what happens is these chromosomes are in pairs, so there's 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we can see those in certain things, in pictures and things like that. But we're just going to talk about it simply, and I'm going to draw a picture of a pair of chromosomes. And remember, on the chromosomes, the chromosomes are made of DNA, and sections of DNA are called genes. So let's say right here, this section is a gene for eye color, and it's on one of our chromosome, one of these 23 pairs up here. And so just one gene is for eye color, and maybe this gene here or section is for blue eye color, and maybe this section is for, let's say, green eye color. And these will be called alleles. This gene here is an allele for blue color, and this gene here is an allele for green eye color. Now, we're going to learn a little bit more soon about if you have a green gene and a blue gene, what does that actually mean for eye color? Are your eyes bluish green? Are they blue? Are they brown? How does all that work? We haven't learned that yet. But for now, what I want you to understand that an allele is just different forms of these genes. So this one maybe codes for blue, so that would be a blue allele for eye color. This one maybe codes for green, and so that would be a green allele for eye color. But when I say the word allele, to me it is the same thing as gene. So allele equals gene. And we already know what a gene is. It's a section of chromosome. So is an allele. But when we talk about specific traits, we usually use this word allele. Now, one other thing I want to go over about genes is that many times we have genes, or the word we just learned, allele, can be dominant or recessive. And we're going to learn more about this when we look at our next section, which is on something called Punnett squares, which is a tool that is used by geneticists or people who study genetics. But I want you to start to understand this at this point of our learning, and that is if we have a gene. So again, here's my chromosomes, and a section of the chromosome is called a gene. They're always in pairs. We can have what are called dominant or recessive genes. Dominant is a term we use for alleles that cover up other alleles. So it's a trait that is strong or dominating. So for example, if, again, looking at our pair of chromosomes, if this chromosome here codes for blue eyes, and is a dominant trait, it will cover up whatever gene is on the other one, and blue eyes would win. So if blue eyes is a dominant trait, then if somebody has an allele for blue eyes, they would have blue eyes. And it doesn't matter what the other gene is. If it's green, and we have determined that blue is dominant, then the blue would cover the green, and you would get a blue-eyed person. You wouldn't get blue-green eyes or anything like that. You would just get blue eyes. And so the blue eyed person would be dominant, and then the blue gene would be dominant, and then this allele here would be recessive. And recessive is considered to be kind of a weaker gene. It is covered up. It does not mean you are weak or somebody is weak. It's just the gene gets covered up. So it's not as strong as the dominant trait, and it gets completely covered up. Again, we don't get a blending of traits in this sort of genetic study. Now, not all genes exhibit dominant and recessive behavior, but many of them do. And so we're going to study that a little bit more later. One example of this we saw in class already was this idea of earlobes. And if you remember back in class, the dominant trait versus detached or attached, we saw way more earlobes that were considered to be detached. And so we observed in class that this trait of detached earlobes seems to be a dominant trait. We have more of those in society, at least in our classroom society, than we did attached earlobes. And so detached would be a dominant trait, and attached would be recessive. Well, that's it, guys. We'll see you in class tomorrow, and hopefully this all made sense. If not, you can watch it again or ask questions in class tomorrow. See you tomorrow.